Hey there, folks. My name is Taliesin Govannon, and welcome to Modern Pagan History 101. Now, this is going to be a brief series where I go over some of the notable people who helped bring about today's modern neo-pagan and Wiccan Renaissance, and some of the contributions that they've done along the way. Today, we're going to start out with Gerald Gardner, really the guy who started it all when you're talking about the modern Wiccan movement. But what a lot of people haven't told you is that there are a lot of non-Wiccan movements that also started with Gerald Gardner. But I'll get to that a little later. First of all, let's cover some of the basic biographical information. Gerald Gardner was born on the 13th of June in 1884. He was born to a fairly well-off family who had made their fortunes in the timber industry around Liverpool. Now, of course, Liverpool used to be one of the main shipbuilding areas of England, so the money went back a little bit. Now, Gerald was a sickly child. He had what he often called the occultist disease of asthma. Now, what do you do if you're a well-off family and you've got a kid who just cannot handle an English winter? You send them abroad. And that's what happened to Gerald Gardner from a very young age. He was sent off during the cold weather months every year with his nanny, who was nicknamed Calm. She would take him from port to port around the Mediterranean, where the weather was much better for an asthmatic boy. It was also good environments for a young woman who wanted to find a husband, and that's what Calm was really after. She pretty much left Gerald to his own devices most hours of the day. And he was a smart kid. He was an inquisitive kid. He actually taught himself how to read. Now, when I tell you how Gerald Gardner taught himself how to read, you're going to be amazed that this guy went on to write multiple books. Although, when you also find out how he learned to read, you won't be surprised that he always needed a good editor. See, what Gerald Gardner would do is he would find newspapers that were English language. There were so many British expats traveling around the Mediterranean during the day, you could always find a newspaper that was in English. Well, Gerald would find a newspaper and find one with a picture of, say, a boat or a horse, and he would go and bug the guys who were hanging around in the bars. And yeah, Gerald spent time in bars because that's where Calm went to go meet men. He would ask people in the bars, show me this word. Show me the word that means boat. Show me the word that means house or horse or whatever object he was looking at. And after a while, he figured it out. He figured out how to read. He figured out how to write. Of course, he also figured out how to write phonetically, which meant that his spelling was quite atrocious. But hey, there's a lot of us writers who are slaves to the spell check today, so I don't think any of us can judge Gerald all that harshly. Now, once Gerald got done being a young man, and once he hit the point where he was supposed to go into business or find a career, his parents found him a job in the rubber plantations in Malaysia, actually down in Ceylon. There was a big English rubber industry during the day, and these were the colonies where they got the raw materials to make things like tires and all the other stuff they made out of rubber. Gerald Gardner started out working on a plantation. And while he was there, he actually made friends with some of the local Malaysian tribespeople. Now, the local Malaysian tribespeople were quite tickled to find a white Westerner who wasn't trying to convert them to Christianity. Gardner wanted to find out what their religion was all about, and he was a very attentive student. Later on, Gerald would go and do an archaeological dig, trying to prove that there were great cities in Malaysia's past. You see, at the time, a lot of archaeology was a very young science at the time. Very few things were standardized, and a lot of it was controlled by the prejudices of the day. Most scientists didn't believe that ancient Malaysians could have possibly had huge cities because the current state of the Malaysian people were living in tribes in the jungle, very close to what the English would call savages. But Gardner wanted to find out about what these people did, and they told him stories of the old cities that used to be. So Gerald went and he dug and he found one of the ancient cities of Malaysia. As a matter of fact, years later, when a college would send an expedition to go and excavate this site properly, they used Gerald Gardner's maps to know where to dig first. However, eventually the bottom fell out of the English rubber industry. At this point, Gerald's father needed to find another job for him, so he got him a job with the English Civil Service. Now, for my American viewers, when we hear somebody's gotten a civil service job, that usually means that they went to college for far too many years to get a job that is that low paying. But in England at the time, being part of the civil service was just what you did if you came from a well-to-do family and you couldn't make a go of it in the private sector. Gerald wound up being a customs inspector and spent years riding around the back swamps in Indonesia trying to find smugglers and other criminals. And eventually, it came the time for Gerald to retire. And Gerald returned home to England, a country that was his birthplace, but had never really been his home. He settled in an area of the New Forest near Christchurch, and he started looking around for mystical and occult things to do. You see, while Gerald had been in Southeast Asia, he had not only become a Freemason, which is something you did if you were an Englishman living abroad and wanted to talk to other British people, but he had also gotten involved in things like spiritualism and ceremonial magic, and just fascinated with the entire realm of magic and the occult. Now, what he really wanted to find was a group that practiced religious magic, much like the Malaysian tribespeople did. You see, magic in England at the time, especially ceremonial magic, had grown very clinical. It was one of those things that you could do no matter what religion you were a part of. It's kind of funny. I remember there was a quote from Isaac Bonowitz once. He said that there are all kinds of ceremonial magicians. There are Christian ceremonial magicians and Jewish ceremonial magicians. You even get some agnostic ceremonial magicians. You don't get any atheistic ceremonial magicians, though. They wind up becoming parapsychologists. But I digress. Gerald was fascinated with the mystic world, and he was really excited when he found out that there was a group putting on occult and alchemical plays right in his area. It was the New Rosicrucian Theater, and it met at a small community theater right near Christchurch, and Gerald Gardner was a part of it. He wound up being part of plays, helping with staging, all kinds of stuff. In fact, there's a photo floating around that I wasn't able to find before I made this video that claims that there's Gerald taking part in a production of, I think, Faustus or something like that. However, the person who's supposed to be Gerald is covering his face like this because he's being very thoughtful, so it's hard to tell if it's really him. But we know that he really did attend the New Rosicrucian Theater and events at this hall because there are sign-in books that have his very distinctive signature. Now, I'm about to diverge two stories here. One is the story that Gerald told, and the other is what really happened, or so those of us who are interested in Wiccan and pagan history think what happened. Now, what Gerald said is that he said he found a group of people who were hanging around the New Rosicrucian Theater who claimed to be co-masons. Now, co-masonry was a form of Freemasonry that didn't discriminate against women. Gerald really liked co-masonry because he liked hanging out with intelligent, strong-willed women. So he started hanging out with the co-masons, figuring they were his type of people. However, within this other group, he found a smaller, more secretive group, one that kept to themselves, one that he said was more working class. You could tell these people, worked with their hands for a living. And he started hanging out with them and discussing things like magic and, ancient witchcraft. Margaret Murray's books, the Witch Cult in Western Europe and the God of the Witches were very much in the public mind at the time. And after a while, Gerald says these people told him, well, you seem to be one of us. Why don't you come back and rejoin us? In other words, they felt like he had been a member of their group in a previous life and that he ought to come back and join them again. It was in the midst of the ceremony of welcoming that he heard the word Wicca for the first time and realized he was being initiated into Margaret Murray's ancient witch cult, something he thought had died out long ago, but he found out was still in existence. And that's how he became initiated as a Wiccan, as a witch. Now, what we really think happened is that hanging around some of the occult societies at the time, there were a group of people who were practicing what they called witchcraft. And Gerald made contact with these people. Now, for years, people have tried to say that the coven that initiated Gerald didn't exist. They say that he made it all up, just like he made up other things that he tried to pass off as fact. However, we know that this coven exists now because Phil Heselton, an English author and Gardnerian initiate, has done the legwork. In his books, Wiccan Roots and Gerald Gardner and the Cauldron of Inspiration, he goes over the process by which he identified the people who had been in the group that initiated Gerald Gardner. And he goes through his research and his logic extensively. I highly recommend those books. The thing is, though, is that whatever this group was doing, they weren't practicing Wicca as we know it. Even people who work in the older traditions, like Gardnerian and Alexandrian and the like, will admit that a lot of what passes for Wicca today was stuff that Gerald Gardner and Doreen Valiente put together. But there was a group before Gardner's debut coven, as it were, a group that did initiate Gerald. And people don't really know what they worked or how they worked. I've got my own theories on this, but that's for another video. Eventually, Gerald Gardner left that coven. Other people say he was thrown out. But he wound up taking his high priestess with him, a woman who went by the name of Daffo. Now, Daffo is the unsung hero of the history of early Wicca because she provided Gardner with a high priestess to help him work these rituals. In traditional Wicca, it's always been said that initiation should go between genders. In other words, a woman initiates a man, and a man initiates a woman. And so Gardner wanted to keep to this, and having Daffo in his life certainly helped him do this. There's some evidence that Daffo was also one of Gerald's multiple mistresses throughout his life. But again, that's another video. Eventually, Gardner set up a new coven. He initiated new people, and he started bringing them into things and started them working this new form of witchcraft that he had put together, taking what little he could take from his original coven and combining it with a whole bunch of stuff from Aleister Crowley and the Golden Dawn and Freemasonry and William Butler Yeats and all kinds of different sources. But really, what would happen to change things even more is when he met a woman named Doreen Valiente. Now, I'll get more into Doreen's story when I do a workshop about the life and times of Doreen Valiente. But suffice to say, she came in and gave modern Gardnerian and indeed most of British traditional Wicca some of its most beautiful ritual passages. It also really sewed everything together, Doreen's contributions, and eventually Gardner's coven grew. The coven met on the grounds of a nudist colony that Gerald had first been a member of and then wound up purchasing when he found out that it was going to close down because the owner wanted to sell it. And he would have his coven meet in the witch's cottage there at the nudist colony. Makes sense. I mean, where else can you have a bunch of people naked in a room, and if anybody peeks in the window and sees them, it's not going to really raise any questions. That's the good thing about meeting at a nudist colony. And this coven grew. The coven grew to the point where it started hiving off other covens. Now, by the time it did this, though, Gerald was already long gone. You see, Gerald was never somebody who could stay in one place for very long, and eventually he bought Cecil Williamson's original witchcraft museum that stood on the Isle of Man. And once he bought the witchcraft museum, Gerald moved out there full time to tend it and to try to make a go of it as a realistic business. He also used to sell copies of his books there, and there are a few lucky people left in England who have one of these hand-signed copies of something like High Magic's Aid. Now, Gerald Gardner has a lot of controversies, but you can really make the case that none of us would be where we are today without Gerald Gardner. And let me explain. You see, Gardner did something that others had been trying to do but failed. He was trying to bring forth paganism into the modern age, something to do with the old gods, something where magic wasn't considered unnatural and strange, but an entirely natural part of both life and your religious expression. People have been trying to do this for years, but nobody really landed until Gardner came out. I mean, Gardner was a bit of a publicity whore, and there are some very sad tales of his thirst for publicity hurting people. But the fact of the matter was, he got the word out, and he got people interested in things. His history with the press was very spotty, but it still attracted the right people, the people who wanted to come learn this new form of witchcraft that they had just discovered, this Wicca, and continue to do it for the rest of their lives, teaching others and spreading the craft. Just about every major pagan movement of the last 50 years, even in America, can trace its roots back to Gardner. Why? Well, because Gardner brought the world Wicca. And once Wicca came over to the U.S., it wasn't very long before people started doing their own styles, or what they called eclectic Wicca. And if you take a look at a lot of the people who started some of the groups that have been around for a very, very long time, groups like Andriac Fane, ADF Druidry, and fairy tradition, and many of these things, you'll find that either the people who started them started off in Wicca, or the early people who started coming around, especially with Victor and Cora Anderson's fairy tradition, were coming around because they had heard that witchcraft was real and that it wasn't satanic. And in fact, there was this really groovy goddess that you could worship if you were a witch, as well as a god. And so groups that weren't Wicked would still wind up picking people up because they had heard about this Wicca stuff and, oh, wow, this is the only group I can find. I guess I'll hang out with them. Even the people who claim to be non-Wiccan witches take inspiration from people who started off in Gardnerian Wicca. Robert Cochrane, who started really the whole non-Wiccan witchcraft movement back in the 60s, even he was initiated into a Gardnerian coven in 1960. Now, he tries to say, oh, well, I was just being initiated by them to see what they were doing. I call BS on that, especially after looking through some of the Cochrane materials and seeing just how much Gardnerian craft and mores are in there. And really, much of the non-Wiccan witchcraft movement that exists to this day takes a lot of inspiration from Robert Cochrane. I mean, I just talked about ADF Druidry. Well, Isaac Bonowitz started ADF, and when he was stapling together the first pamphlets back in the early 1980s to send out about this new Druid order he wanted to form, he was stapling those pamphlets on the floor of his New Jersey home with his wife, Deborah Lipp, who's a third-degree Gardnerian priestess. And as a matter of fact, Isaac himself was initiated Gardnerian and wound up becoming a third-degree high priest. Now, he did it when his wife really needed a high priest and he needed to fill in, but it goes right back to it. A lot of people in non-Wiccan pagan traditions started out either in Wicca or they got there somewhere along the way. So in reality, much of what we see in the pagan world today, aside maybe from Church of All Worlds, because we all know that Oberon was cooking this stuff up before Gardnerian Wicca even came to the United States. And when Gardnerian Wicca came to the United States, by the way, it came on the East Coast, and Ka started off in Missouri and later moved to the West Coast. So it was quite a while before the Church of All Worlds people ran into Wiccans. But aside from groups that came off of Church of All Worlds, just about everything you find is going to come either from someone who started in Wicca or someone who was interested in paganism and magic, and they read a book on Wicca and thought, well, this is all good, but it's not quite my thing. So they go off and they form their own thing. And yet, you got to know that part of the influences that go into it is, comes from Wicca. The influences come from there. They're either stuff that they lifted that they liked, or it's stuff that they avoided because they didn't like. In any sense, if you're reacting against something, it's still having an influence on you. Gerald Gardner died in 1964. He was abroad. He was on a ship when he crumpled to the deck, died almost instantly of a massive heart attack, and he was buried in Tunisia. And the rest of us are in a world that has been made incredibly more entertaining and more vibrant and more fulfilling for the work that Gerald Gardner did. Now, I'm sorry if this talk seems a little jumpy and a little scattershot. I could sit here and talk for about, 72 hours straight about the subject of Gerald Gardner in the early days of Wicca. But I was just trying to give you a highlight here to get you going. Okay, that's all for today. My name is Taliesin Govannon. Thank you for watching Modern Pagan History 101, Episode 1. And if you like what you saw, go ahead and hit like down below. You can also subscribe and hit the little button to get all the notifications on my channel. And you know what? If you have any questions about Gerald Gardner or something you'd like for me to cover in a future episode of Modern Pagan History 101, go ahead and drop me a comment down below. I read all the comments, even if I don't respond to all of them. So if there's anything you want to know or a subject you want me to cover on the show in the future, go ahead and let me know. My name's Taliesin Govannon one more time. Blessed be.